In Jerusalem this past year, Jerusalem experienced its worst unrest in years as racist Israeli settlers, backed by Israeli police and the army, have been attacking Palestinians in cities across 48 Palestine, particularly in the neighborhoods of Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, as Israel enacts its policies and practices of ethnic cleansing and illegal land annexation it has been enacting since the 1948 Nakba and the 1967 Nakba. In the weeks leading up to the 73rd anniversary of the Nakba, Palestinians rose up to resist Israeli attacks in Jerusalem, particularly during the holy month of Ramadan. Israeli forces raided the Al-Aqsa Mosque, gas worshippers attacked and arrested many Palestinians that were at the site. The Israeli military then escalated their violence, launching airstrikes into the besieged Gaza Strip, killing approximately 212 people. On May 18th, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians across the occupied West Bank, Gaza, and 48 took part, and as well as the diaspora, took part in a historic general strike on May 18th, 2021, launched a unity intifada that brought together the disparate geographies and populations in a unified resistance, and were also joined by the international community who have participated in solidarity demonstrations. In dozens of cities across the US, Canada, and elsewhere around the world, demonstrators have gathered to express their unequivocal solidarity with the Palestinian people. We saw thousands in the streets in the US, Canada, and the UK rising up for Palestine in unprecedented numbers. And some have said that we've seen numbers around solidarity with Palestine that we haven't seen before in the Western world. This Palestinian uprisings came on the heels of ongoing organized resistance against settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation that has been going on inside, as well as large-scale racial justice demonstrations that were seen the year before, specifically in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. That year and the years before, we also witnessed large-scale demonstrations in support of indigenous liberation and their struggles against pipelines, climate change, and indigenous sovereignty and self-determination across Turtle Island and elsewhere. Historically, internationalist solidarity with Palestine has a long and deep history, particularly among third world movements in relation to the Palestinian Revolution that forge insurgent geographies of connection and strategic alliances in opposition to imperialism, racism, and capitalist violence. We have seen the resurgence in international solidarity in the past 15 years, specifically around the boycott, divestments, and sanctions movement that has regalvanized international support premised on principles and guidelines that target colonization, apartheid, and occupation. We are also witnessing joint struggle campaigns connecting structures of colonial and capitalist violence across these geographies. And so this morning's panel discussion will explore the historic and contemporary bonds of solidarity between anti-racist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial struggles of African Americans, third world, and indigenous struggles as expressed in their common support for the cause of Palestine. Our first speaker will be Ali Abunimah, who is a director of the widely acclaimed publication, The Electronic Intifada, an independent nonprofit publication focusing on Palestine. He has written hundreds of articles and spoken on the topic all over the world. He is the author of One Country, A Bold Proposal to End the Israeli-Palestinian Impasse, and The Battle for Justice in Palestine. Ali, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chandni, and thank you to the organizers of this event, bringing us together from so many places around the world. And you can't see it, but I'm actually sitting in my car because I'm traveling this weekend. I decided to take a trip to Michigan to get out into the country. And I'm actually sitting outside the public library in Holland, Michigan, which is on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. And the view I've put up behind me is the view from Mount Pisgah in Holland State Park. And in the background, you can see Lake Makatawa. And it's a very, very beautiful area. If you ever have the chance to visit it, I highly recommend it. It's an area that was settled by Dutch settlers in the mid-1900s, and they're very proud of that. You can see everywhere memorials to the Dutch settlers and signs explaining the Dutch colonial history of this area. But what's completely missing is any mention. I've had to look and do my own research to find any mention of the indigenous people of this area, the Anishinaabe people, and particularly the Odawa people who inhabited this area before they were expelled and also attempted to be forcibly converted by the Dutch settlers. And that's a reminder that settler colonialism is everywhere around us. And it is not a historic event that happened in the past, but it is an ongoing process. It is an ongoing genocidal process, and one that needs to be constantly re-legitimized with the kinds of pioneer narratives that we see in this area on all the signposts I've been looking at this weekend, but also everywhere that what's called history is written. We're speaking now at a moment when I think about what's happening in Palestine, of both great hope and great excitement and motivation. And you'd think, how could that be following the horrific massacre that we witnessed in May in Gaza, which, as Chandni mentioned, more than 200 Palestinians, 250 Palestinians were massacred. We've been watching in utter horror and despair the efforts to rescue, sadly unsuccessful efforts to rescue people from the collapsed condominium building in Surfside, Florida. The story of so many families, of so many people, have been saturating the media in this country, and understandably so, because of just the sheer unimaginable horror of losing family members in such a way. And yet, such horrific, and that what happened in Surfside, Florida, was, you could call it an act of God, an accident. Perhaps there is some liability involved in those who decided to maintain, who were responsible for maintaining that building. But such horrors were inflicted deliberately on people in Gaza. Just a few short weeks ago, the Al-Wahda Street massacre, in which dozens of people sleeping in their beds were deliberately bombed and killed, and their buildings collapsed onto them to kill them. Some families lost members spanning entire generations, with elderly people in their 80s killed along with the newest members of their family, barely months old, which also reminds us that that this is a genocidal process. So we mourn these horrific murders inflicted by Israel. At the same time, we see Palestinians reveling in a renewed sense of unity and purpose in their resistance. Palestinians have always resisted. This is one of the important things I learned about indigenous. I knew that Palestinians always resisted because this is a struggle I'm close to personally. I was always told that indigenous people in North America and Turtle Island no longer existed, that there was no resistance anymore because the genocide wiped them out. It took me a while to learn that that resistance also never stopped and is ongoing and continues. So what the Palestinian resistance in May reaffirmed was the unity of the Palestinian struggle, and that it is very much alive. Remember that less than a year ago, with Donald Trump in the White House, Israel and various US client regimes supported by US imperialism and US weapons, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and others, signed so-called peace agreements with Israel, which they thought they were celebrating. They thought they were celebrating their marriage to Israel over the dead body of the Palestinian cause. But less than a year later, they learned, perhaps to their dismay and chagrin, that Palestinians have not given up their struggle by any means. And for the first time in many decades, perhaps ever, we saw an uprising in every part of historic Palestine, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in the 1948 conquered areas that are known as Israel, and of course in Gaza, where a small territory under siege for 14 years, isolated from the world, was able to resist and bring Israel's economy to a standstill for almost 2 weeks, to shut down flights to all of Israel's airports, and to impose on the besieger and the occupier at least a small measure of the siege and isolation that Israel has inflicted on Palestinians for so long. The other miscalculation that Israel made was, with the full complicity of or rather, let me say, with the impunity afforded to Israel by the so-called international community, Israel was encouraged to accelerate its ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Jerusalem, particularly in the neighborhoods of Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, in order to accelerate the transformation of Jerusalem from a city which has always been multi-ethnic, multi-religious, a city with a Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, and Christian character, to try to turn it into an exclusively Jewish theme park. But a theme park whose creation involves incredible violence against the city's indigenous people. Israel thought they could get away with that with impunity. They did not imagine that Gaza would resist and intervene on behalf of Palestinians in Jerusalem. So the resistance is very much alive and has reaffirmed its presence and its legitimacy. So much for the situation in Palestine that we will certainly say more about. But what I want to also comment on is that we saw laid bare in May, once again, the global support structure for settler colonialism in Palestine. Who were the states and the governments that stood staunchly by Israel as it bombarded families and demolished their homes on top of them, as it demolished houses in order to steal the land under them from Palestinians in Jerusalem and across the West Bank? Of course, it won't surprise anyone here that it was the United States, that it was Canada, that it was the European Union and Australia. These are the strongest supporters of Israel. And of course, it is no coincidence that it is the settler colonial states and their founders, so to speak, the European states, that constantly proclaim their shared values with Israel, that are the biggest suppliers of weapons to Israel. This affinity is expressed in ideological terms, in terms of so-called shared values, something that former President Barack Obama always loved to talk about. He would repeat the myths of Israel's founding, along with the myths of America's founding, that myths that reassert so-called manifest destiny and the naturalness and rightness of conquest and settler colonialism. But they're not only ideological, they're material. Of course, I've talked about the weaponry and the funding that the US and others supply to Israel. But Israel, you could say, also gives back to its sponsors. And we see this expressed in the, particularly over the last 2 decades since the September 11 attacks, with Israel becoming the world's marketplace for so-called homeland security, with literally hundreds of delegations of police chiefs and police officers from the United States, from virtually every major city, including my home city, Chicago, going to Israel to learn Israel's supposed prowess in counterterrorism and countering violence, ideologies and techniques and technologies that are then applied in US cities against predominantly Black people who live under what has been described by many as a sort of military occupation, which again was laid bare over the last year with the renewed and constant and never-ending spasms of white supremacist police violence against Black people in the United States. So I'll just close these remarks by saying that what I'm in a process of constantly learning is the extent to which settler colonialism is an ongoing process, one that is present. We Palestinians talk about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948 as the Nakba, the catastrophe. But we also insist that the Nakba is ongoing, the Nakba never ended, and that our task is to bring the Nakba to an end. But it has also been part of my education to learn that the Nakba, whatever it may be called in the different languages of indigenous people in North America, has also not ended. The Nakba of slavery has not ended because there has never been full restitution and reparation. So the settler colonial states remain a firm alliance with each other, perpetrating these ongoing Nakbas. And so our task is to work out how to connect our resistance, our intellectual resistance, our activist resistance, our advocacy, and also to understand that in Palestine, people are exercising their right to resist with the means that they have, and that includes also defending their right in Palestine to engage in armed resistance against colonial occupation and military attack by Israel, which is a joint attack, again, supported by so many states around the world. So I look forward to hearing the comments of the other panelists and participants, and to continue to learn how we can deepen and expand the solidarity and the solidarity that is without which we cannot liberate and decolonize our countries. Thank you.